Morning. Okay, it's more a case of this was sold as Ask for Lived Experience. So I was going to call this a brief look at 30 years plus of struggle with disabilities, convincing employer with disability, a disabled archaeologist is worth employing. So I'm just going to be looking at the barriers with a little bit of things that might have worked to overcome them. Okay. Disability barriers tend to be divided into three sections: actual problems caused by the disabilities, attitudes of employers, problems caused by changing legislation. First, in my case, admittedly, is what problems caused my disabilities. Absolutely none, despite club feet and vertigo attacks. The vertigo is not so serious with me anymore because we've now discovered what was causing it. Frustration. Frustration with two aspects. One is, as you might guess, my gender identity. Where I come from is a very transphobic area. For about 50 years, I've known what my gender was and have not been able to express it. End result, up to 10 seizures a day. Working in 2022 as a fine archaeologist with Historic England, being able to be both Kymberly and an archaeologist full time means I only had one little tiny attack, and that was right at the end because I was leaving. Unfortunately, the other aspect of the frustration hasn't been addressed, which is lack of employment. The latter is a bit of a vicious circle, since the more rejections I receive from employers, the worse the vertigo attacks get. The vertigo attacks are themselves responsible for the rejections, at least when it comes to most non-digging roles, since they mean I cannot drive. Ever since I graduated from Cardiff in 1990, I've run into that obstacle. While employers will occasionally employ me on fixed-term contracts without a driving license, as HE did in 2022, they're rare, and most permanent fines, etc. roles, employers won't move over on the driving license. Most employers? Yeah, okay. So that's where the second disability comes in, the deformed feet. Due to club feet, I can't dig on commercial infrastructure projects. This means that in the very rare cases when an employer has been prepared, or said they would be, to work around a lack of a driving license, I still keep working out, losing it to people with recent commercial experience. Right, I can dig. My actual deformities place no restrictions on what I can physically do. If I wasn't here, I'd be either training tonight or running a black belt only session in Shotokan karate. Last night, I was running a black belt only session in Shaolin Kung Fu. I can walk across terrain all day, full pack. I'm actually fitter than I was when I was in the army. And in that case, it was only because of a malaria attack I didn't make the SIAH. So, physically, I can do that with a 60-pound weight. That's well over a third of my body weight. And if I'm on site, yeah, full bucket. Oh, sorry, I forgot that's full. But it won't be half of that. However, what it does mean is I can't wear modern standard safety boots. Penetration-resistant soles don't enable you to go up as if you're wearing a high 8-inch heel. I mean, people see these heels; these aren't touching the ground when I'm walking. So it's not my disability has been the barrier. It's a combination of employers' attitudes and change legislation. Employers' attitudes. I have dug commercially, but not since 1999. In the 80s and 90s, employers were prepared far more to take people on site-specific contracts, and that's when I actually found more adjustments were made for disabilities because people were less concerned with, yeah, we know you can do that site, so we'll employ you. I used to get cases where, sorry, you can't work on this site, we need full safety boots. And then same day it's, are you still free? Yeah, okay, we've got another contract for you. Right, now I have been in contact recently with a number of employers who've assured me this shouldn't be a barrier because not all digs actually require sole protection by law, and employment law requires employers to rotate me around roles that do not. All these conversations have the same features. It's always somebody being asked to give feedback. The person saying is never actually hiring at the time. When they are hiring, they don't reply or say, sorry, we can't make an exception on this occasion, try somebody else. Okay, so that's actual physical barrier, but we also, I've also encountered actual discriminatory attitudes. And many of the people who have in the past stated them still have senior positions within archaeology and museums. A good example of this is a small unit that went out of business in 2008. I'd sent off a quick application in response to an ad in The Guardian. Any of the older people remember those? And got offered a short contract digging. Steel toe caps were quite okay then. Right. It was the way dig. We were all eating together in the local pub. That's when the problem occurred. One day, the dig director, who was also co-owner of the company, asked me why you don't ever see me drinking soft drinks. I told him it's because of medication I was on for the vertigo, and he was, to say the least, unhappy, accusing me of concealing information. Although he did shortly say afterwards he understood why I did it. Actually, I hadn't deliberately concealed it. It just wasn't an issue. And admitted he probably wouldn't have hired me had he known. And now he knows I'm taking that medication, he wouldn't hire me again, which was an interesting comment considering how much he praised the excellence of my work in writing and also how relieved he was I'd applied, since I was the only experienced archaeologist who'd actually done so. It's an interesting reflection on attitudes that he'd rather run a site short-handed than employ a disabled person whose work he praised. The shocking thing about it is actually the company were otherwise good employers. At the time, they were one of the best payers. They had good gender balance. They had a relaxed working attitude, excellent away accommodation, excellent subsistence rates. However, some aren't good on any count, which I'm saying the biggest block on my career was in 1992, the result of a repeat contract with what was then my only local employer. The director of the dig was constantly denigrating me because of my deformed feet. One example, which occurred more than once, was instructing me to take off my safety boots, despite this being an infrastructure project, to clean up something she'd noticed needed removing before photography. Her reasoning for always giving me the job was that my fairy feet, and yes, that is the exact quote, and remembering I was identifying publicly as male at the time, meant that no one would mistake my footprints for anything made by a human being. They'd assume, oh, it was some animal had got on there. After 5 weeks, I told her what I thought of it, and she basically said, well, you're not working for this company again, which for 30 years she has managed to enforce, because quite often I've run into people directing work for that company and they've said, we have only got half the number of people, why don't you apply? Application. Sorry, we're full up, no suitable vacancies. So, on top of which, we also still have attitudes you will still hear expressed. Whenever the issue of non-drivers finding it hard to get work is raised, there's always a kickback. Discussions on groups like Badger always trigger comments to the effect that having non-drivers is a nuisance, even if we're discussing medical-based adjustments for non-drivers. That people feel comfortable in saying this and not pulled up for it by admins may suggest how deep those attitudes go. It was further driven home to me in 2020 when union reps were calling on archaeology companies to ban employees from commuting via public transport. Obviously, there was a health reason. But when you pointed things out, you got the same initial problem. Oh, it's a problem. It's a nuisance having non-drivers. Oh, and just because you're disabled doesn't mean we should actually make any allowances for you. Right. It was interesting. I wonder how many other disadvantaged groups people would feel comfortable publicly posting on Facebook. Oh, it's a nuisance making adjustments for you, or not be slapped down for doing so. There's also what you will still get is, oh, sorry, I didn't realize. 2022 was when I actually came to most people as being transgender. At the time, I was working on a project for Historic England. I'd arranged with the senior staff that at the end of the project, for the last 3 weeks, I would come out and be Kymberly. It was interesting that on that same day, various commercial partners were making transphobic jokes and comments. It wasn't aimed at me. They didn't know. But what was interesting, it was that feeling of, oh, we can make whatever, that we can make those comments. And then when you know, the comments don't reapply, they don't reoccur. Does suggest that left me felt there was a lot of prejudice about many things hiding behind a veneer of what is publicly acceptable. Okay, just quick on the legislation. Changes in legislation have raised barriers in disability employment within archaeology. Many of us remember the old Manpower Services Commission schemes to assist the unemployed. While the emotions conjured are mixed, two things are undeniable. It started the careers of some very good archaeologists, and it did widen participation in archaeology over both the short and long term. What most people don't know is actually we do have similar schemes available today. However, unlike the 1970s, there are new barriers to the implementation. The first is what Tony Robinson always goes, oh, health and safety legislation. Increased requirement for PPE and also the CSCS card have made employers reluctant to engage with these schemes. Or that was the feedback I got from some employers following a 2018 paper at TAG. Few said they'd like to participate, said they can't because of those issues. Of course, a lot of other employers said, well, we don't need to because our schemes give us all the people we like, so we don't want to make those adjustments. Which may go back to that one about, it said, ask an employer who's not advertising for staff, and he will say, oh, yes, that adjustment should be made, that adjustment should be made. Oh, now you're hiring. Sorry. Right. Related to that is also guidelines. I had a big dig at some of the chief guidelines in 2023 TAG conference, because, again, a lot of employers have come back and said, it's not legislation, but it's sort of that the restrictions on non-salaried staff act as a major barrier to participation in these schemes, because unless you've set it in 6 months before when you applied for, you put in the tender, you can't have non-salaried staff. Right, the time. Okay, this does tend to lead to barriers, in part because a lot of people with disabilities have often gone for non-standard ways of getting their experience, non-commercial. When I started in the 80s, nobody asked whether your experience was commercial. They said, oh, how many hours have you got? How many weeks have you got? Now, it'll go for commercial, unless they're very, very desperate. Again, the number of times I've been out competing for roles, and it's gone down to, someone's got 6 months in a role, I've got 10 years. But they've got 6 months commercial. So whether this is an unfortunate byproduct of professionalizing archaeology is unclear, but it is certainly a barrier. So, quick conclusions. There have been a lot of improvements over the past 5 decades with archaeological employment. Unfortunately, sometimes feel a lot of babies have been thrown out with the bathwater. Improvements to safety are welcomed, but the blanket implementation is tending to exclude disabled people. In part, of course, that's because we have better conditions. Believe it or not, our archaeology pay is much, much better than when I started. My first paycheck was 3.5 times what I would get on the dole. Now it would be about 5 to 6. We've got health and safety protection. Away accommodation used to be, pitch your tent over there, mate. As I said, it's the same with increasing professionalization. There's great upsides to it, but the downside is devaluing of non-commercial experience. Too often, even the roles that people could fulfill with disabilities are filled by commercial people moving sideways rather than getting us into training schemes. The only routinely positive change I've seen is that except when discussing non-drivers, it now seems less acceptable to use derogatory language directly aimed at the person or in their hearing than in previous times. However, is that really an improvement? Personally, I'd rather hear transphobic or ableist banter while in work, not be there to hear it because I'm in the job centre. The more so because I get the impression that the barriers caused by these attitudes haven't gone. They're just cloaked like a lurking Klingon bird of prey. Thank you.